Greetings and bienvenue, MITZU. Thank you for returning to this broadcast. And welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
Hello/X/, I would like to share a story with everyone. A long time ago, my family used to be the shamans of our tribe. Of course, now we don't really have such a thing anymore, much less a real tribe. All I've got is my card, marking me part of the Passamaquoddy people. My immediate family moved away from Maine, and we now live in New York. But in my childhood, we lived on, or at least near, the res. Anyway, it was during this time that I experienced the strangest events I've ever had in my life. My whole family is suspicious of strange experiences. My grandfather tells me it's because of our heritage, but mine is strongest of all, because of the strange circumstances of my birth. First of all, I originally wasn't supposed to be born. I basically died at birth, but the doctors were able to resuscitate me. I was born 2 months early. I'm not going to go into what this is supposed to mean, but a lot of people who believe in the old ways think I'm basically half dead. And that means I've always got shit following me around because they think I'm one of them. Anyway, due to this, my grandfather insisted on being a strong part in my life. My mother didn't really mind. She endorsed it, in fact, because she worked a lot, and she felt that getting in touch with my heritage wouldn't be a bad thing, all in all. So it was always my grandpa who I would run to when something bad was happening. For example, when I was a tiny little thing, I would often see wild dogs around our house. They would run off like little girls when anyone else but my grandpa and me got home, but they liked me in particular. For no apparent reason, they scared the living bejesus out of me. I would often tell my grandpa that they kept smiling at me and trying to get to come into the woods with them, where we would play. But, I said, their smiles were all curly and wrong, and their eyes looked red and evil. My grandpa told me that I shouldn't be scared of them, as they're just weak, cowardly little spirits, and that I was protected by a much stronger spirit who saved me when I was born. He brought me back from the land of the dead, and he would be with me when I died. In fact, as I grew up, Grandpa always told me this. If I was scared of something, he would always tell me to be brave, because I was protected by the spirit with me. He didn't teach me much of the old ways as my mother wanted, maybe, but he taught me a lot about what was there that we couldn't see. As you might expect, I was a weird kid. I cried a lot at things that other kids couldn't see, like hysterical, hyperventilating bawling. This made me extremely difficult to play with, or even really talk to, so I was eventually disliked. There was a patch of woods in particular that Grandpa told me to never go near that the kids loved to play in. The kids caught on to my near-phobic aversion of the place and managed to drag me there at one point because A, I wanted to be popular, and B, because they wanted to bully me. Keep in mind, I was about 9 or 10 at the time, so good sense and listening to what adults tell you really wasn't in my skill set yet. So there we were, in the heart of the woods, and the kids start talking about the creepy shit that was supposed to have happened in the woods. Europeans were supposed to have gone mad when they got to these woods, when they were in the middle of a heated battle and started slaying each other. It was really gruesome, apparently. People peeling off each other's faces, eating fingers and toes, etc. And then, maybe sensing the evilness that was in this place, when the Europeans managed to beat us away from the vicinity of this place, honestly, I think we may have given it up without much of a fight. They decided it was a great place to burn them some witches. There's differing opinions on whether or not the witches actually channeled supernatural powers, but there's at least one recounting of a particular witch whose ghost still haunts these parts, ALAA eating missing hikers and stealing the wayward child. And then, of course, in a much more recent example, there were a bunch of high schoolers who hung out regularly in the woods in the 80s who started showing some bizarre behaviors. Moodiness, irritability, and the story that something big, bipedal, and with hooves kept walking around their rooms at night and snorting and saying horrible, vile things and threatening them at night. Eventually, 2 of them snapped, brutally tortured, and killed the 3rd boy in the woods by setting him on fire in a barrel. And guess what? It was all supposed to be because of the spirit that lived in those woods. This was something the kids didn't know, but I did, because my grandpa had told me. It all came flooding back to me, and I wanted to leave the forest immediately. The boys I was with were maybe 12 or 13, so it was the perfect age for boys to get petty and cruel, and they only laughed at me, calling me a scared little girl, which I was, grabbed me, and stuffed me into a little shack made of sheet metal and plywood, with no windows and a padlocked door. They told me a cannibal lived in the shack, and he would be back for me, and then eat my skin. Of course, I began screaming and pounding at the door to let me out. Even if a cannibal didn't live in the shack, I didn't want to be in it, or the woods in general. The boys hung around the shack for a while, pretending to be the cannibal coming back to get me. I knew it was then, but I kept screaming and begging them to let me out. It was then I realized that there was actually something in the shack with me. I realized it was there because I could hear it breathing on the opposite end of the shack. For whatever reason, this made me stop screaming. I don't know if it's because I was too terrified to make sounds, because I wanted to hear it, and I couldn't pause my screaming or didn't want to provoke it. In any case, once I stopped, I realized it sounded like somebody breathing heavily past a mask, kind of hollow and echoing. Maybe I shouldn't have stopped screaming because once I did, I could also hear it moving. I don't know if it did because my screams kept it away, or I could only hear it moving then, but it was a long sort of dragging, like a gigantic snake was dragging its body across the floor. It was at my neck in an instant, and I could feel its breath through its nostrils, fluttering my hair. So beautiful. It's so beautiful. I bit my lips to keep from screaming. I think I made them bleed. I made the thing a deal in my head. If it left me alone and left the boys outside alone, though I don't know why I was nice enough to include them, I would give it one thing on me that it really, really wanted: go 10-year-old logic. And the thing agreed. And suddenly, I got this overwhelming sense of sadness. It was lonely, and I wanted to be with people again, like a dog that had been rejected by people again and again. What it really wanted was a home. I don't know if I'd make the same choice again, but I told it could have a home, though I didn't know at the time what was on me that could give it a home again. And then I blacked out. It was stupid hot in that hut, though I don't know if it was because of the fact it was summer and I was in a steel enclosure, or if somehow it was giving off extra heat. But in any case, when I came to, I was back in my house with my grandfather sitting by my bed. When he saw that I had woken up, he smiled at me, but he looked enormously sad. When I asked him what was wrong, I wasn't hurt. In fact, I felt just fine. He started crying a little bit. He never treated me like a little kid. He always imbued an adult-like sense of gravity with everything he did with me, even if it was making pancakes. He told me that the boys had come running back to town because they couldn't open the shack. The key that was to the padlock, which was actually a curing shack of one of the boys' uncle, had snapped unexpectedly, and I had stopped making noise. Worse yet, they thought there was something in there with me, because they heard me talking to it softly. My grandfather and a few men were fetched, and they managed to open the shack together where I was found, apparently collapsed from heat stroke. Grandpa said that he had tried to keep me out of the woods for as long as he could, but it had only been a matter of time before it had found me and taken what was rightfully its. Our family had been bound to a god that the land belonged to a long time ago. However, in a time of great famine and war, people offered up the blood of their children to get the god to spare them. This had made the god angry because he had been forced to eat children's blood, and he slew the people. When people came back to the land, they weren't the people that had been there before, but the god was already twisted and strange from lack of companionship, and the last thing he'd eaten was child blood. The people, terrified that what had happened to the people before them would happen to them, avoided the patch of woods, which became forbidden. It still is, to this very day, but no one really remembers it. Instead of leaving offerings to where they thought the god would be, or praying to something the god lived in, this god was carried within a person in order for it to live. And now, it is now in me. Apparently, It had consumed the spirit that had been with me and had taken up residence in my body. After that, my family moved off the res and to New York. My health became slightly poorer than it was before. I was prone to respiratory infections, bronchitis, the whole 9 yards. I had to go to the hospital a couple of times when I was a little thing, but I got better by the time I graduated high school. I'm back, but I don't know how much time I have. The day before yesterday, I went on a long walk in the high heat. I was sick and disoriented, and he was waiting for me in my apartment. He was angry that I had mistreated myself. I just opened the door and walked into darkness, and he was talking to me and crying. I told him over and over that I was sorry. I don't know, it could have all been some sort of hallucination from heat stroke, but when I woke up, I suddenly knew that I was going back to the res. In the next 30 minutes, as I drank water and tried not to die, my mother called me. She and Dad and my younger brother were going to the res for the rest of the summer and wanted to know if I wanted to come. I said yes. The thing is, I'm never sure if what happened was all a product of native superstitions and a heat stroke 10-year-old. I guess that's the cynic speaking in me, but other times I know differently. There were definitely times where I knew things I technically shouldn't have known and had no reason to know. There have also been times where I've known to avoid certain places and discovered there was danger there later. For example, when I got older and was in middle school, I was kind of ostracized for being the new kid. I got bullied a lot, but eventually I would know somehow to avoid certain places where traps were set up for me, even if the place had never been used before. I would just get this nope feeling and see jackass kids walking away from it later. Dogs, since that time, have had a pretty ardent dislike of me, except really friendly, derpy dogs. Also psychics, but that's another story. Sensitive people have been able to see the God in me. I mentioned psychics before and how they didn't like me. The God didn't like them either, apparently. Whenever I'd be around self-proclaimed psychic friends, he would react badly to them. Strange things would start to happen. At one point, one of my friends, after doing a reading of me, found a hunk of some sort of raw flesh in her purse. She blamed me, but of course I didn't do it. But that was really the last straw between us, and the most, I think, dramatic thing that happened when she was there. This girl was obsessed with finding out the true identity of the God inside of me, even though I already knew and explained it to her. She said she wanted to know his name, which, if anyone knows any better, would know that's a bad thing. Apparently the God did too, and was rather offended by her. Like I said, whenever she was around, strange shit started happening. Stuff of hers would go missing, like stuff she had literally just put down, and show up in weird-ass places. Her bottle of water was in my washing machine. Her tube of chapstick ended up placed delicately beneath the wheel of her car. One of her set of feather earrings was found impaled on a tree by a small, thin stick. At first, she said it was her spirit guides trying to protect her from a hostile entity, and they were trying to send her messages to warn her. But then, when she was about to leave my apartment, she said she was threatened by a sentient darkness that lurked at the door and wouldn't let her through, and gave a booming laugh that made her start feeling insane. I didn't hear any booming laugh, but she swore by it. She was so scared by this darkness possibly following her, she made me walk her home. On the way, we were stalked by something that kept about 20 feet away from us at all times, and as I was saying goodbye to her at her apartment door, gave a long, piercing, inhuman shriek. If you've ever heard a bull elk, it sounded much like that, except longer. After the raw meat incident, she pretty much stopped talking to me, and that was basically that. She left me a weird voicemail maybe a day after that, though, telling me to stop coming by and begging her to let me in and staring into her windows, because she wasn't going to. But I had never been to her apartment again after the time I had walked her home. It was weird how quickly she dropped me, since we were pretty good friends before she did. Of course, there were other people as serious as her about finding out about this God. Usually, they would sense a powerful aura about me, something unnatural and inhuman, and I would tell them the story of my God possession the way you'd tell a ghost story. This was in the hopes that they would get bored and move on to something else, but instead, they would fixate on me. Another girl tried to leave offerings to the spirit. He seemed to like her for that, as she reported minorly good things happening to her all week after. Even though they probably would have happened anyway, she was just noticing them more, until she decided to try to give him a little bit of her blood. I tried to convince her this was a bad idea, but she eventually cut her wrist with the X-Acto knife she had with her and tried to make me drink it. She had a sharp knife that she could seriously hurt me with, so she ended up forcing her wrist to my mouth without too much fighting from me. Luckily, I didn't ingest any of her blood, but that really didn't seem to matter to the god all that much. That night is kind of a haze for me, in fact. We weren't drinking, but I look at that night as if I had been. I have really patchy memories about it, and I'm not sure if they can even be all real. I remember looking out the living room window and seeing about 30 deer just standing in the lawn, looking back at us. This freaked out my friend, and she ended up pulling the blinds. My lawn is rather spacious, so it's not unusual to have deer aplenty on it. Standing there and staring like creepers is a bit more. Later, we heard banging in the ventilation pipes, which freaked out my friend and me. It didn't seem to stay in one place, but went the length of one pipe before ending up in the basement and going out for another pipe. During the end of this, I thought I caught sight of a white, mask-like face behind the vent of one of the pipes, which made me have a minor panic attack. Apparently, my friend couldn't see it, even though she was there while I was staring at it. After this, my memory of that night gets even more spotty, and I'm not sure how much of it I can trust. I remember chasing the girl down a corridor with a knife, but I can't remember if I was chasing her or if we were running away from something. Then, at some point, I remember trying to hide in the attic, holding the knife and crying silently as I heard something huge pacing the hallways outside. In the morning, everything was normal, and the girl acted like nothing weird had happened, so I don't know how much of this was a bad blood trip or something. She still did have the cut on her wrist, though. I don't know if I was the cause of it, but she moved away shortly after that without talking to me about it at all. When I asked her later, she told me that some weird stuff was going on in her life, and she wanted to get herself sorted out.
OP, you should really make a blog to log your past experiences and future ones with this god thing. Can you sense him right now? What's he thinking or doing?
I might. It's not something I'm super forthcoming about. I've had a history with telling people the truth, only to be called crazy and a liar, even by my own parents. I can't usually sense him. I feel perfectly normal, and it only ever changes if something is offered to him or I'm in danger. And then it's not a really direct knowledge of him. Usually my senses get overwhelmed, and I basically start tripping, for lack of a better word. Sometimes he communicates with me, but not usually in words.
Well, the blog doesn't have to have any identifying info, but I understand after what you've been through. What's the last thing he communicated to you?
The last thing was he was incredibly displeased with me for going on a 4-mile walk in 98-degree weather and some weird hallucinations. Now that I'm back on the res, he's a little more active than normal.
Well, I suppose the upside is you always have someone looking out for your health? You mentioned before you were unfortunately ostracized as a kid, in part for knowing things you weren't supposed to know. Can you tell us a little more about that? And sorry if this dredges up painful memories.
It's no problem. I'll survive. A few things I shouldn't have known sucked, though. For example, when I was about 11 or 12, for some reason, I just knew something bad was going to happen to my dad. It really upset me all one day that summer, until I spent the whole morning laying next to a stream in the woods and crying. When I came back home, I found the house in an uproar. My mom had been looking all over for me, and my brothers had been sent out to find me. I have 2 brothers. My dad had been injured at work by a machine. Luckily, nothing had been chopped off or lost. He had only been cut and sent to the hospital to get stitches. Another time that I felt that same amount of dread was when I had been in the forest again during that same summer and had suddenly had the startling revelation that there was a dead body where the stream became a more respectable creek. I even knew where it was and how long it was going to take me to find it. Somehow, even though I'd never been in that part of the woods before, I knew what path to take to get to the body. It turned out to be the body of a girl who had gone missing several days beforehand. She was recently pregnant and took her life when she found out. Those are some of the bigger examples I have. Some of the other ones are finding lost or misplaced objects and knowing who I'm going to be meeting, talking to throughout the day. Weirdly enough, the smaller examples are usually where I get in the most trouble. I once found my mother's missing wallet because I somehow knew exactly where it would be. It was just a clear snapshot in my mind. My mom was going nuts looking for it and was snapping at my brothers that they were going to be in such trouble if they took it. I went out to the garage, no idea why it was there, and brought it back to her. She was shocked at first, and then suspicious. She never came out and directly accused me of taking it, but even then I could feel it was heavily implied. There was another time that I knew my brother was in trouble at school. I wasn't sure exactly how I knew, but I could tell he was upset and hurting, even though he acted perfectly normal. I even knew the name of the kid that was hurting him. So one day, I told my mom what was going on, and once again, she was shocked and suspicious. I think she had a little sit-down with my brother and the principal, but luckily, he didn't get bullied again after that. I heard that the kid had weird stuff happening to him after that, too. Somebody left a skinned animal carcass on his family's front porch. At first, my brother was suspected, but when it became clear it would have been impossible for my brother to do this, he was out of town with our older brother at the time, the accusations were dropped.
What is this thing's name? Most obvious questions haven't been asked by other anons yet, so I'll be the one to ask them, I guess.
I'm not supposed to say his name, but people call him Piskopu, meaning the one who sits in the dark.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.